In Icelandic culture, they're probably much more laconic. There are fewer words said. There's a lot of hinting at things. There's a lot of things being discussed euphemistically, really, or stories being told to hide something. But there are, of course, this sense that the story is just fundamental to us, is that it has to be told and that it has to be shared.
And that's the voice of Gunnþórunn Guðmundsdóttir, a literature and culture professor at the University of Iceland in Reykjavik. And Gunnþórunn, or Gunn as she's called for short, has had the opportunity through her work at University College Dublin and its Ireland-Iceland project to see how the cultures and storytelling of Ireland and Iceland resonate against each other, to see their similarities and their differences. I'm Helen Shaw, and this is Mother's Blood, Sisters' Songs, the story of how the genetics of Iceland reveals its Gaelic roots. So in Reykjavik, Linda Buckley and myself had the chance to sit down with Gunn and find out more about her perspective on place, literature, and how storytelling shapes belonging.
So I am Professor Gunnþórunn Guðmundsdóttir, and I teach in the comparative literature studies at the University of Iceland.
And I know recently you were over in Ireland and UCD as a visiting professor. What was that experience like, and how do you feel there are parallels between, say, storytelling in Ireland and storytelling in Iceland?
Well, it was a great experience. It's always a great way to get to know people, to actually stay for a while and not just come over for a 2-day conference or a meeting and you rush off again, but being able to stay properly. And I was there for 8 months. It's a completely different insight into the place and a different feeling for it. I had a long connection with Ireland through London, where I lived for 10 years, and so I had many Irish friends, and I felt when I came there first, maybe 5 years ago now, that I was coming home in some sense or another. And so it was great to be able to just be there for a while. As regards to storytelling, I don't really know what it is like in our world now, in our contemporary times, what it is really like. Is it really alive? Is it really as important, as current as it was? But I think for both places, the myth of it is very real, and I think people do consider it a part of their culture, definitely. And so you get the definite feeling for it. But I think, there are parallels, but there are also differences. Differences in, I think, maybe the character. If you can talk about a character of a nation, you immediately turn to cliches and stereotypes and so on. But there's always a bit of truth maybe there, and the truth about the silent Nordic person isn't just a myth. It's actually quite real sometimes. And of course, that's very different from interaction in Ireland than it is here, I think. So I think maybe in sort of everyday transaction and everyday life, there are definite differences in the way that we think of it as part of our culture and part of our heritage. I think there are lots of parallels.
And in the way that stories are told, do you think there are parallels there as well?
I think one of the things that characterizes Icelandic storytelling is the size of the place, or the size of the population rather than the place. And this closeness and this sort of constant nicknaming of everybody, and this sense of belonging and the sense of the story being part of who you are and part of your community and so on. I think there's lots of parallels there. But I think there are also differences that it may be hard to quantify and hard to describe exactly, but they are there. They are, in Icelandic culture, they're probably much more laconic. There are fewer words said. There's a lot of hinting at things. There's a lot of things being discussed euphemistically, really, or stories being told to hide something, but there are of course this sense that the story is just fundamental to us, that it has to be told and that it has to be shared.
And could you tell us a little bit about the Ireland-Iceland collaboration?
Yes, this came about a few years back when I met some colleagues from UCD, and we got into a discussion about, I think it was just over the conference dinner, where that's where things happen sometimes, and we found that there were so many parallels in our histories, and so we really wanted to explore it, and we wanted to explore it through literature, and we wanted to explore it through memory and literature, how cultural memory is represented and reworked and reimagined in literature. So we've had two small conferences, one in Dublin and one here, and we had some people who were interested in things that we've felt were parallel. Of course, we have the medieval times during the settlement of Iceland, where the connection is very physical and very real and documented. And then we have the parallel of the fight for independence. Iceland is a long-time colony of first Norway and then Denmark. And the connection that we have with the old empire is also, I think, relevant. There is the 19th century nationalism and revivalism and so on that we have in common. We also have in common that we have maybe anomalous stories of the world wars. Iceland was neutral, was occupied by the British in the Second World War, and so on. So we don't have the same story that is told, for instance, in Britain and in France and so on. So then one of the other things that we wanted to explore was the 2008 recession, because there were so many parallels, but also so many differences in the way, in the aftermath of the banking crash here in Iceland, for example. It was very different from what happened in Ireland. And we wanted to explore that and see what was happening in literature, how were people dealing with it, and so on and so on. So we found all these areas quite interesting. We also found things like landscape, the theme of landscape in literature, very important in both countries. And also, I think what has really been, I think, fruitful is to compare the sort of peripheries, not always compare the colony to the colonizer, or the smaller to the bigger and so on, but these North Atlantic peripheries that are very close geographically and geologically. There are coastlines in both countries that are exchangeable, really, and we have so many sort of similar trajectories, also with the relationship to the rest of Europe and then to the US and so on. So I think it's been really nice to look at it that way, to see it as the peripheries are talking to each other and not just to the power, to the empire.
And do you feel that there are parallels at the moment in contemporary literature, let's say things like Scandi Noir, that sense of darkness? Do you see a kind of a connection there?
Yeah, I think there is a connection. I think, and especially just in the last decade, and maybe a little more, because I think in both countries there was literature and fiction that was very wary of the boom, wary of the Celtic Tiger, wary of the huge boom years here, and of the materialism, of the change in culture that was happening and so on. So I think it was that was already there, I think, in both countries. And then after 2008, there is also a really important parallels, writings on these ghost estates, for instance, that both countries had, and how they figure prominently, for instance, in crime fiction in both countries.
And the creation of atmosphere in the writing, is that something that you've seen as a sort of a similarity between both places?
Yeah, I think so. I think there are definite parallels there and similarities, and just an interest in the same things, interest in a certain loss of national identity, and sort of this need to rewrite what's happened, and to rewrite the bigger narrative, the story we are told about what happened, and it's necessary to investigate it and see what's behind it and tell the other story, perhaps of those people who really usually do not get a story. And what was also interesting, I think, and I think it happened in both countries, is this, you can call it a trauma, but you can also just call it a societal upheaval or some crisis or something like that rather than trauma. But it does bring back memories of other trauma. And just the thing, you somehow reverse back to something that was before. In one way, you're looking for a golden age. You're looking for when everything was better, now everything is ruined. But you're also somehow seeing parallels with other difficult times. And this means that you are sort of revisiting maybe things that haven't really been explored before properly. And of course, with all the abuse investigations and all of that in Ireland, of course, there's not such a violent and traumatic history here. But our history of the Second World War, for instance, was not explored that much. The story was that we got rich at the time, and that was absolutely fine. But why did we get rich? People didn't really want to investigate that. What was it on the basis of? And also the incredible change that the war brought. The occupation, thousands and thousands of soldiers in this tiny little place, which had never had a military. And how modernity came in a decade in Iceland, which for all societies, modernity, the arrival of modernity is traumatic in a way when you sort of the traditions of society just are torn asunder and then you have to adjust to a new world. And that all happened very quickly. And the story has always been told that, it was just time of prosperity and finally, we were brought into the modern world and everything was great. But it forgets that what lies behind it and the trauma that people who were there experienced. And this, I think you can see in crime literature, for instance, in the work of Arnaldur Indriðason, for instance, he keeps revisiting the Second World War now, and that was only post 2008 really that he did that. So I think that's very interesting what happens in times of crises.
I'm also interested in the voices of women writers over the years here and their place in Icelandic literature and the stories that they tell. Maybe could you tell us a little bit about that?
I mean, the second wave of feminism here had great influence, not least into the 1980s when the Women's Party was formed and so many legislative improvements were made and so on and so on. So of course we've had a very different story from many of the things that happened in Ireland, but it's still the marginalization of the work of women was still always there, and you can still sense it in some ways. But nowadays we have so many really prominent young female writers that have really created their own voice and are very important also as cultural commentators and so on and so on. So that is also has changed quite a lot in a few decades, I think. But I think we will see maybe in a couple of decades that this generation, that this group of people were really influential in the way in which they explored these issues in literature.
And then I'm just curious, over the last few days we've been deeply immersed in the Melkorka story and that sense of a slave history here in the settlement of Iceland. I mean, what is your reaction to that in terms of it being a myth, a story? Is it reality? How do you feel about that story?
I think our perception of Gaelic and Irish settlers here in Iceland has changed quite dramatically in the last couple of decades, or maybe a bit longer than that, but this has been sort of filtered through the archaeological work and the work of the medieval scholars and so on, that we are getting quite a different picture of what it really was. The story of the slave woman was, of course, the story we were brought up with. This was the reality, and this sense that it was more important to be of Nordic extraction, that it was very important for everybody to be able to trace a genealogy to a Norwegian king, and that was really sort of a hobby for many, and now can be easily done through decode. But that narrative has started to change, and it has also there is a sense in which the Icelanders would really like to be closely related to the Irish. There's a certain cultural longing for that, which I think is interesting, but that's a sort of, I think because we are in a certain way on the periphery of the Nordic countries, and because we are a former colony of theirs, there is a sense that the relationship is imbalanced, and that we would much rather go further south and talk to our friends. And this has manifested itself in very interesting ways, I think, both of course, in the genealogical research. So that's interesting, but I also think there are things like in a little village close to Reykjavik, Akranes, they call it the Irish Days, which is a really interesting festival because they have a very cliched idea about Ireland. It's all leprechauns and so on. So it's and for the first couple of festivals, there was so much drunkenness that the town had to cancel. There was all kinds of problems with it. But just looking at the website, you can see all these cliches and myths coming in. So it ranges from that kind of sort of where you've turned Irish culture into three things or something, and to the sort of academic interest in what was really going on and who is the slave woman and what was that, and or was it really that it was Irish settlers that came themselves and not just brought as slaves. So there's all these narratives that I think are very prominent and keep coming up in the last few decades, and I think it's interesting to speculate why and how it happens.
And why do you think there is that sense of cultural longing to connect from Icelanders to Irish?
I think it's an impatience sometimes with the Nordic countries that they're sort of very formal in some ways that Icelanders are not, and that somehow this sense of being a small island on the periphery is just much more suited to our character and to our tastes than some of the other things.
Professor Gunnþórunn Guðmundsdóttir there, talking to Linda Buckley and myself at the University of Iceland in Reykjavik. And you can see a short video of Gunn's interview with us on our website, mothersblood.sistersongs.com. And do check out some of the additional resources we've been collecting there around this project. Thanks for listening.